Great. Well, thank you, Alice. And it's a pleasure to join the OHA community here today and speak a little bit about the work that's gone on to create the Universal Agreement for Clinical Trials and what that means and what our expectations and hope is for this as part of strengthening the competitiveness and impact that clinical trials have in Ontario. I think if you can move the slides forward for me. Yeah, great. So about a year and a half ago now, the Clinical Trials Ontario CTO, under the leadership of the CEO, Susan Marlin, decided to work towards an effort that they've been involved in for many, many years around increasing the competitiveness and impact of clinical trials in Ontario. And what CTO did was to assemble a leadership table in Ontario. I had the fortunate opportunity to lead that table, and it brought together leadership from academic centers across Ontario, those centers that are deeply involved in carrying out clinical trials, the research-intensive hospitals, but also brought together leadership from leading pharmaceutical companies. We had representation from most of the big pharma companies, including their highest level of leadership in Canada. And it also brought together leadership in government, including all three industries where our industry intersects with: the Ministry of Colleges and Universities, MCU, Med, JCT, Economic Development, Job Creation, Trade, and Ministry of Health. And this recognizes the multi impact of clinical trials on improving health in Ontario, but also in helping create great jobs and an industry in Ontario, and advancing research, which is the mandate of the Ministry of Colleges and Universities. So we had the ministers from those departments attend our meetings and senior representatives throughout the entire process. And having that entire constituency, I think, was really key to advancing progress towards this. Next slide. So again, the focus on clinical trials is as I mentioned, is key for Ontario's health research overall, our capacity. We have terrific clinician scientists and organizations across all of Ontario. And if you look at the overall capacity of that, it really rivals any other jurisdiction in the world. The goal here was to provide a path, with clinical trials, obviously, to provide a pathway to more effective therapies. But also to think about how Ontario can be competitive in attracting businesses and keeping companies in Ontario, and also advancing our overall healthcare system. There's a position paper that was put together, and the first thing the leadership table did was really look at all aspects that we thought might be important or might be necessary to improve the impact that trials have in Ontario and our competitiveness, from a global perspective. And we identified 5 key areas that we want to work on going forward. And that was outlined in a position paper that was published just a year ago now. There's a QR code there if you haven't had a chance to look at that, but it does outline all of those different areas. But the first area and the most important from a kind of starting point that we identified as a group was timely access to clinical trial opportunities and a focus on clinical trial startup activation times. This is really important to industry. It's really important to patients, and it's really important to all of our organizations. And we decided to be very ambitious, to set a target that would be global leading, that would make us amongst the most competitive places in the world, and to reduce trial startup time to 45 days. That's the ambition. That's the goal. It's going to take a while for us to get there, and we're going to have to address many different components of that. But we want to be ambitious, and we want to be competitive in doing this. Other places have done this. People talk about Australia a lot. They've gotten very organized, and this has attracted a lot of attention from pharma and clinical trial opportunities. And it's been brought about by an agreement in leadership to do things collaboratively, to do things systematically, and by doing so, really reduce trial startup time. Next slide. So there are many kind of pieces to that. And once we sort of set that target, we identified a number of processes that we think we're going to have to target. There aren't single bottlenecks in the system. There are multiple places where trials get stuck or where startup time is affected. But chief amongst those that we decided needed our attention first was clinical trial agreements. So CTO has previously created a REB board of record. This has been really important for multi-site trials, that they only need to be reviewed by one REB and then be recognized and approved at other centers. But in the past, our clinical trial agreements are all individual negotiations between a pharma sponsor and the institution carrying out the trial. And it's been frustrating for everyone involved, the principal investigators, the clinicians, the legal teams at each side, and certainly with industry when they need to go and negotiate differences in agreements with every single site, which is often a very lengthy process and often drawn out. So the goal here was to create a single clinical trial agreement that was the vision for that being that it's an agreement that's essentially non-negotiable. It's agreed to up front. And it can be used as a template and a very rapid process for activation. And this is what other places have done. This is what Australia did. Spain has done something similar. Quebec has worked on a structure like this. And to stay competitive, for Ontario to be competitive for clinical trials, it's really important that we have a structure like this to simplify that negotiation, simplify that agreement phase. And it's really in everyone's interest. There are other components that we're addressing as well. Similar kinds of templates for informed consent, potential templates for budgets or release rate cards so that there isn't a budget negotiation process with every single site that's different. And also standardizing what those documents and requirements are. And essentially the concept here is to do virtually all of the hard work first up front to create a series of standardized templates, standardized approaches, get that agreement and the work to be done. And then when it comes to the actual individual trial activation, this simply becomes a sort of a pick and choose process, and it's relatively quick to do. It's very different from what we have now, where all of those things are negotiated individually and at individual sites. Next slide. So, I'm pleased to say that this has led to the creation of the Ontario Universal Agreement for Clinical Trials, or UACT. And this has been officially launched. So there was an enormous amount of work, and I want to thank all of the organizations across all of Ontario, the legal departments, clinical trial teams, the pharma sponsors were all involved in creating this document. And it was officially launched in November 2024. And the organizations around the leadership table have agreed to implement that as a template. Here at UHN, we have implemented this, and it's our standard approach for activating clinical trials going forward. And while this has been developed as a tool to help achieve the overall 45-day activation target, the support for this and streamlining it is going to be provided through CTO and through other sort of means like that. And you can see just a copy of or a template of that's shown there. And I think what's really key here is that we want this to essentially be a non-negotiable clinical trial agreement. We don't want it to be a starting point for a negotiation where people are looking for changes. There may be elements of this that might not be perfect yet, and there's a commitment to continue to iterate this and improve this over time. But what's really key here is that we want organizations to adopt this and to assist in the implementation. This will really only work if everyone gets behind it and decides that we're going to use this and use it as a way to simplify and make Ontario more competitive. If every organization wants their own little changes to this, it's not going to work. Next slide. So, the benefits of adoption, I think, are quite obvious. There's been a lot of thought that's gone into here, and thanks to Lydia and all of the legal teams that have done so much work to get us to this point. It's obviously using such a makes this consistent and predictable for our sponsors, for our users, and over time, this becomes much easier because everyone fully understands what will be in those agreements. It creates significant time and cost savings for each of our own clinical trial agreement specialists and legal teams because there's not a lot of back and forth and redlining and contract and discussions that have to happen. And what we really think is that this will make us more competitive. It will create more opportunities across Ontario, more opportunities for involvement of smaller centers in Ontario, more access to patients, more timely access to opportunities, and more first-in trials that are done here in Ontario. So this use will certainly benefit patients. It'll benefit our organizations, it'll benefit our science, and it will benefit our economy by bringing more revenue and more resources to Ontario. Next slide. So the implementation is underway. Part of the reason for this webinar today with the OHA is just to make sure that everyone is aware of this. We want each of the institutions to really buy in and go back and try and work towards this implementation. The UACT document, you can scan the QR code, it will take you directly there. There's also a series of tools to support the implementation and guidelines, a communication toolkit, key contacts, FAQs on the CTO website. And the CTO team is there to support you in terms of any challenges that you might have on the implementation. But we certainly want to expand the use of this well beyond the leadership table. We want it to become a standard for Ontario, and we want as much as possible to support all the institutions that are involved in clinical trials in the implementation and activation of this new approach. And there will be further iterations coming to this, and there will be other initiatives associated with the leadership table to aid in moving towards that goal of a 45-day trial activation. Next slide. So I think I've gone through here. It's sort of key aspects. As I mentioned, we want the parties to agree to the use of this in an as-is way, no changes. This is really important, and the real vision for this is a non-negotiable contract in all aspects. There are still elements that will be customized to individual trials, but the leadership table is working on future iterations to, again, simplify those. We're going to be tracking surveys and metrics to help assist in the implementation and ensure that this is being implemented. The real hard work is now on the implementation phase, and it's a real collective responsibility, as I've mentioned. The way that we're implementing it at UHN is we're not changing existing templates or existing contracts, of course, but when they expire, we're going to transition over to the universal agreement, including where we've already negotiated template agreements with specific partners. We have a number of those in place, but we're going to transition all of those to the UACT as trials expire and as we move to new trials going forward. And next slide. I think that's it. So that the request here is for all of you is to seize the opportunity to help us on this ambition to make Ontario more competitive and on the clinical trial space. I think, with what's going on politically, there's all the more reason to do that, to make sure Canada and Ontario remains a very attractive place to do clinical trials and to bring new medicines and new diagnostics and new devices to our patients. We're looking also for your support in this process, your input, your feedback. As I said, this will be a continuous iterative process, and there will be opportunities for improvement. But there is a request now to move forward with the great work that's already been done and what's in place, knowing that many of your organizations may find specific aspects that you think are not perfect. We think the risk tolerance here is and the risk benefit is at such a point that it makes sense, and certainly our organization and many others have decided to go all in and really endorse the movement and the benefit that this UACT will bring for Ontario.